The 7,000-page secret report, known as the Pentagon Papers, became one of the greatest revelations of state lies in the history of American journalism. It showed that 4 successive U.S. administrations, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, systematically lied to the public about the true goals and scale of the Vietnam War. The total volume of the report was 7,000 pages, across 47 volumes, comprising 3,000 pages of historical analysis and 4,000 pages of original, top-secret, sensitive documents. The papers, covering the period from 1945 to 1968, were first published by the New York Times on June 13, 1971. The start of the secret report was initiated by deep doubts at the highest levels of power regarding the purpose of the war. Beginning. The Secretary of Defense's doubts. In March 1967, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who personally oversaw the escalation of the war, began to harbor deep doubts. Contrary to official statements about a light at the end of the tunnel, McNamara, a disillusioned technocrat, realized that the war machine was working against his logic. He initiated a comprehensive study to understand how decision-making had led to such deep involvement. Inception of the study. How did this happen? In June 1967, McNamara instructed his aide, Deputy Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, to lead a project for a comprehensive analysis of American policy in Indochina. The group consisted of 36 analysts, half military officers, half scholars and civil servants. All worked in the strictest secrecy. The goal was to answer a list of 100 questions devised by McNamara, including, how accurate are enemy casualty figures? And, when did overt U.S. intervention begin? A tragic turn occurred in July 1967, when John McNaughton died in a plane crash. Les Gelb, a Department of Defense official, continued the project. The covert process. The historians of war. From 1967 to 1968, 36 researchers worked on the analysis, answering all 100 questions. They examined reports and documents that remained invisible to the public. However, this process was conducted in such deep state secrecy that even McNamara himself later did not read the complete report. According to Les Gelb, McNamara never reviewed the finished document before his death. The study would reveal that the Kennedy administration concealed operations against North Vietnam since 1954, that Johnson simultaneously swore peaceful intentions while preparing for war, and that the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Incident was partially fabricated. Transfer of power. Nixon receives the dirty secret. On January 15, 1969, the finished report was received by the new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, just 5 days before Richard Nixon's inauguration. Clifford later claimed he never read the full report. The documents remained locked in the safes of high-ranking officials. The new Nixon administration viewed the report as dangerous material, keeping it highly classified, fearing that revealing the facts of Johnson's lies could also call their own Southeast Asian policy into question. The Pentagon Papers became direct evidence of the systematic lies and escalation of the war, hidden from the public. Exposure of the Kennedy administration. The documents showed that between 1954 to 1964, the Kennedy administration, while knowing that military victory was impossible, continued to increase U.S. involvement. Specifically, they concealed from Congress and the public Operation 34 Alpha, under which American commandos attacked North Vietnam covertly, even before the official start of the war. The administration also rejected the possibility of peace talks in favor of escalation. Exposure of the Johnson administration. The most shocking revelations concerned the Johnson administration, 1964 to 1968. The documents revealed that the second attack on the American destroyer USS Maddox during the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, August 1964, never occurred. Johnson knew this, but used the incident as a pretext to begin the bombings. The bombing of North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder, started even before the declaration of war and was carried out under the guise of retaliatory measures. Furthermore, The Johnson administration knew from the outset that a U.S. military victory was impossible, but continued to escalate the conflict, systematically lying not only to the public, but also to Congress. The documents also contain details of American attacks on civilian populations and villages. The truth about the government's lies came out thanks to the courage of one man, Daniel Ellsberg. The analyst's disillusionment. Daniel Ellsberg's journey. In 1969, Daniel Ellsberg, a 40-year-old Rand Corporation analyst, gained access to the Pentagon Papers. A conservative Republican and a combat officer in the Marine Corps, he personally suffered from the contradiction, realizing that the system he worked for was creating and concealing lies. In October 1969, Ellsberg, along with his colleague Anthony Russo, began secretly photocopying the documents using a photocopier at an advertising firm. Over several months, working at night and taking the documents out in briefcases, they successfully copied approximately 7,000 pages, 43 of 47 volumes. Ellsberg's motivation was that he could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public. The search for a publisher, refusals, and hope. Between 1970 to 1971, Ellsberg unsuccessfully attempted to hand over the documents to politicians, such as Henry Kissinger, Senators Fulbright and McGovern, and publishers who refused, fearing charges of espionage. After a year of attempts, in February 1971, he turned to journalists, who recommended the New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan. On March 2, 1971, Ellsberg handed Sheehan 43 volumes of documents, taking on the colossal risk of violating the Espionage Act, stealing government property, and a potential maximum sentence of 115 years in prison. Publication. The New York Times gives voice to the documents. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times began publishing the first article on the Pentagon Papers. The front page featured a long article under a headline reporting serious misconduct by the Johnson administration. Although the New York Times published only about 5% of the total 7,000 pages, the information was now public. The reaction of the Nixon administration. On June 15, 1971, President Nixon demanded an immediate halt to the publication, citing national security. The Justice Department sued the New York Times and demanded an immediate court injunction. The paradox was that Nixon, who had not created the documents, feared the exposure of the previous administration's mistakes, as it could call his own policies into question. The Washington Post joins the fight. On June 17, 1971, after the New York Times received an injunction, the Washington Post, led by publisher Katharine Graham, took a colossal risk and began publishing. Graham, the first female publisher of a major American newspaper, faced the threat of the newspaper's closure and personal arrest, as the government sued the Washington Post as well, demanding an injunction. News that the papers might be shut down circulated widely. The fight for the publication of the Pentagon Papers quickly reached the country's highest judicial authority, the road to the Supreme Court. On June 21, 1971, the U.S. Court of Appeals allowed the New York Times to continue publishing, but the final decision had to come from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court verdict, a victory for press freedom. On June 30, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a historic verdict with a 6-3 decision in favor of the newspapers. The court ruled that the New York Times and the Washington Post had the right to publish the Pentagon Papers. This was an unprecedented ruling in defense of press freedom in U.S. history, establishing the principle of the public's right to know. A key quote from a justice underscored the significance of the decision. The founders of the Constitution gave the freedom of the press a place not inferior to the other fundamental freedoms. The dissenting minority of 3 justices cited national security concerns, but they were outweighed by the majority that supported the constitutional right to freedom of information. After the fierce legal battle, it was time for the legal consequences to fall upon the whistleblower. On June 28, 1971, Daniel Ellsberg voluntarily surrendered to the police, admitting that he had passed the documents to the press. He stated, "I felt that, as an American citizen, as a responsible citizen, I could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public. I did this, obviously, at my own risk, and I am prepared to answer all the consequences of this decision. On January 3, 1973, the trial of Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo began in Los Angeles. Ellsberg was charged with 8 counts of violating the Espionage Act of 1917, 6 counts of stealing government property, and 1 count of conspiracy, facing a maximum sentence of 115 years in prison. The trial had a strongly political nature. However, during the proceedings, it was revealed that the FBI had conducted illegal surveillance on Ellsberg. The most shocking discovery was the fact that the Nixon administration had formed the secret Plumbers Unit, secret agents, to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. These government actions grossly violated Ellsberg's constitutional rights. Consequently, on May 13, 1973, Judge Matthew Byrne dismissed all charges against Ellsberg and Russo due to the governmental misconduct. The trial concluded, but the truth revealed in the Pentagon Papers forever changed American public opinion. Covert war before official war. The documents revealed that the American secret war in Indochina began 10 years before the official declaration of war. Examples included attacks by American commandos on North Vietnam, disguised as South Vietnamese forces, and reconnaissance flights conducted under the guise of air maneuvers. All of this occurred without the knowledge of Congress. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, the lie that became war. The documents confirmed that the incident used by Johnson as a pretext for war was partially fabricated. The second attack on the destroyer USS Maddox on August 4, 1964, never occurred. Johnson knew this, but used the incident to secure the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress, which granted him unlimited authority to wage war. Congressmen were deceived, as they were not informed about doubts concerning the second attack, or the secret war already underway. Administrations lied to each other. The documents showed that systematic lying was the norm. Each administration lied to its successor about the true state of affairs. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson all engaged in deception. The cost in civilian lives. The documents contain details of American attacks on civilian populations. Combat reports showed that areas known to be peaceful villages were designated as military targets. Estimates of civilian casualties ranged from the officially recognized 50,000 to a real figure of 1 million plus people. The publication of the Pentagon Papers led to immediate and long-term consequences that shook the foundations of American politics. Collapse of trust in government. The documents created the first major crisis of trust in the American government during the Cold War era. Public opinion polls in 1971 showed that 53% of Americans believed the government was lying to them. And by 1973, that figure had risen to 68%. The Watergate scandal, from documents to Nixon's paranoia. There was a direct link between the document leak and the Watergate scandal. Nixon was so concerned about the Pentagon Papers leaks that he created the secret Plumbers Unit, secret agents. This same unit later broke into the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate building on June 17, 1972. The attempt to cover up the break-in led to the scandal and, ultimately, to Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974. Nixon's attempt to suppress the information led to his downfall. End of the war. The Vietnam War officially ended on August 15, 1973. The publication of the documents accelerated public pressure to end the war, and Congress refused new appropriations. The war machine stopped. McNamara's resignation as penance payment. Robert McNamara, who resigned in October 1968, allowed himself to adopt the stance of a war critic after the document's publication, 1971, despite his enormous role in its escalation. The interpretation is that McNamara used the Pentagon Papers as an opportunity to rewrite his history from the perspective of the man who warned. The legacy of the Pentagon Papers has long-term significance for American journalism, politics, and morality. Symbolic significance for American journalism. Following the publication of the documents, journalists gained an unprecedented right to publish government documents. The principle of the public's right to know emerged, and press freedom became an integral part of the constitutional framework, cemented by the historic Supreme Court decision. Long-term consequences for history. The Pentagon Papers demonstrated that constant lying can be the norm in government policy, and that even the highest-ranking officials are aware of their deception. The system maintains secrets to avoid political consequences, not for the sake of national security. Daniel Ellsberg, from pariah to hero. Ellsberg endured prosecution, death threats, and ostracism, but later, in the 2000s, he was recognized as a hero of civil disobedience. Until his death on June 15, 2023, at the age of 92, he remained an activist. The Pentagon Papers will forever remain a symbol that truth can be buried but not destroyed, and that the courage of one person can change history. They showed the government can lie systematically and with impunity. The military targets civilian populations, calling them military targets. Administrations conceal facts from each other and from the public. Only the courage of individuals can expose the lies. Questions that remain open. Questions persist, such as, what other secrets are kept in government safes? Could an earlier revelation of the truth have saved 1 million lives? The legacy for the present. The Pentagon Papers serve as a lasting reminder that the freedom of the press is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that civil disobedience can be the highest moral act. Ellsberg proved that his personal act of conscience was a powerful weapon against the state machine.